It was a segregated community. It was a segregated city.
Well, you either, you were a maid, worked in the kitchen.
Oh, everything was segregated.
And we were losing a brain drain. Blacks were leaving here, leaving Charlottesville, leaving other southern communities and moving to St. Louis, moving to New York or to Washington.
You see the determined effort on the white majority's part to keep the African Americans legally relegated to second-class status.
Segregation and the American dream. You know, it wasn't too long ago that segregation was a way of life here in Charlottesville and throughout the South. Hello, and welcome to Living in Virginia. I'm Ned Barker. The story of race is the story of Virginia, certainly one of its most enduring stories, and has been for nearly 400 years. As the 19th century came to a close and a new century dawned, a curtain of segregation came down in the Old Dominion, one that wouldn't be fully lifted until the 1960s. Charlottesville at the turn of the century. It was just a fraction of the size it is today. Riding the streetcar cost just a nickel. And if the skies were clear and you got up high enough, you could see the beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains. Rufus Holzinger was one of the city's best-known photographers. He was a former teacher who came to Charlottesville from Pennsylvania.
Holzinger was setting up shop in a town that was really making the transition from sort of a rural, small town to a city.
His shop was called the University Studio, located on West Main Street. Holzinger's specialty was portraits, but he enjoyed taking pictures throughout Charlottesville and at the University of Virginia. At his studio, he photographed not just whites, but African Americans, including many who hoped to capture a piece of the American dream.
That's really striking to us, the numbers of African Americans in Charlottesville who found the means to acquire property.
In fact, buying a modest piece of property was what it was all about.
It may have been 3 rooms, and they added on to them, but there was one thing they did. They believed in getting their homes.
Not on Park Street. That was out of the question. More likely, in Happy Hollow, Gas Alley, or if you were lucky, on Ridge Street. Scott French is the assistant director of the Carter G. Woodson Institute for Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Virginia. He says on the surface at least, relations between blacks and whites here were pretty peaceful.
That's not to say that living in Charlottesville was easy for African Americans. They were clearly in a lower socioeconomic category. They were coming out of slavery and really struggling to gain a foothold.
French calls the period underappreciated and often misunderstood.
When we look closely at the records from the period, we see sort of a vibrant community life. We see resistance to segregation.
Today, students at the University of Virginia are studying these photographs and using other historical records to create an internet website called Race and Place.
What we're finding is that there's an awful lot more going on during this period than we've ever appreciated.
If you were growing up in Charlottesville, of course, your curiosity touched just about everything. If you were older, you had responsibilities and a family to take care of. Nanny Cox Jackson, a home economics teacher, took care of her family all right. She owned so much property and managed her money so well. She left her family a huge inheritance.
She was able, like today, able to speculate, buy this year and sell 20 years from now at a nice profit.
Charles Coles owned a profitable construction company, one that built new homes throughout the community and did plenty of business with UVA. And George Inge, a teacher turned grocer, operated a successful business as well, a store that catered to some of Charlottesville's hotels and some of the university's boarding houses.
I think most of these individuals ran accounts, where they would pay at the end of the month.
Inge's store was located in the 300 block of West Main Street at the edge of Vinegar Hill.
Vinegar Hill was essentially the black mecca of Charlottesville.
It was, I think, the hub of the town.
Vinegar Hill was a center for commerce, all right. Merchants of both races operated businesses there. And while blacks couldn't sit down and eat at white-owned restaurants, they could shop at some of the other businesses.
The furniture stores and, the 5 and 10s and things like that.
Even so, people still remember experiencing discrimination.
I remember standing in stores as a young child and waiting until all the white people were waited on.
Back then, black merchants couldn't rely on white customers.
Many of the businesses that African Americans had, their exchange, their commercial exchange, was limited to African American patrons.
And just getting a business started was tough.
Banks did not capitalize African American businesses. African Americans capitalized their own businesses and as such were limited.
If you were an African American in Charlottesville and could stretch your limitations, there was a chance you belonged to a group called the Charlottesville 400.
It consists of the barbers, the shoe cobblers, the store operators.
But few African Americans could climb that high. Most simply struggled to make ends meet.
There weren't very many job opportunities. Most people did domestic work, or the people in the county, like my grandparents and great-grandparents, had farms.
At the start of the new century, not only did most African Americans in Charlottesville find themselves at the bottom of the economic ladder, they also found themselves frozen out of politics with a new state constitution that took away their voting rights.
Blacks played very important roles in Virginia politics all the way from the late 1860s up until the mid-1880s.
Brent Tarter is a historian with the State Library of Virginia, which now has the Constitution of 1901 and 02 on display as part of an exhibit on Virginia's political life called A Full Vote, a Free Ballot, and a Fair Count. He says when the delegates wrote their new Constitution, they made no secret of their desire to disenfranchise blacks.
It was pure and simple. They acknowledged this openly, they campaigned on it openly, and in fact the only really serious debates during the convention on the question of the suffrage were whether to disfranchise a lot of white Virginians too.
In the end, they did that as well.
This Virginia Constitution, I think, marks the low point in all of Virginia's political history.
In fact, the Constitution was proclaimed and went into effect, but voters never ratified it. Carter Glass was the most important person at the convention. He was a newspaper editor from Lynchburg and a member of the General Assembly.
He was the one that forged the language of the Constitution that enabled them to drive most of the blacks out of positions of political responsibility in Virginia. He boasted about that.
To Glass, it was worth bragging about because the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution denied states the power to restrict voting based on race, but Glass and his conservative white colleagues found a way to get around that.
The Constitution provided that voters had to pass a literacy test and had to understand or be able to explain to a registrar an understanding of the state constitution.
The problem was that most of the registrars in the state were Democrats, and now they alone would decide who could vote.
If you were a conservative white Democrat, it was very easy to register. If you were not, it was very hard, and most often it was impossible.
The new Constitution also included another restrictive measure, the poll tax.
It was a very complicated system. The poll tax had to be paid essentially 3 years in advance.
How effective was it in reducing the number of voters?
Historians have thought that it was very effective.
Between 1901 and 1904, the number of black voters in Virginia dropped between 90 and 95%. The number of white voters dropped about 50%.
So what was the reaction?
The reaction of the African Americans was disappointment but not surprise. They knew this was coming.
The impact of this new Constitution would be felt for decades.
And ever since this Constitutional Convention, Virginia has had one of the nation's poorest records of political participation and voting in the entire nation. As I say, it's the low point in Virginia's history, and we haven't yet fully recovered from it.
The loss of suffrage for blacks in Virginia was a huge blow for men like John Mitchell, the publisher of Richmond's black newspaper, the Richmond Planet. But it was less of a blow to Booker T. Washington, the internationally known educator who was the most powerful and influential African American of his time.
His view really was a vote's no good unless you have $1 in your pocket.
To get that dollar in your pocket, Washington put his faith in education, industrial education.
Let's do what will be easy to do now, industrial education, manual arts education, making blacks useful in this racist Southern society, and in time we can improve higher levels of education, and in time gain more rights socially and politically.
Washington's views came out of his experience at Hampton Institute, where he was a student in the 1870s, studying under the school's founder, Samuel Chapman Armstrong.
Armstrong was the son of missionaries who had lived in Hawaii, who had seen his parents as Christian missionaries treat those people, the native Hawaiians, as sort of second-class citizens, good people whose souls needed salvation, but who weren't quite up to Eastern standards of civility and the rest.
Armstrong brought this missionary zeal with him when he arrived in Virginia, following a career in the Union Army. Cultivating teachers would become Hampton's mission, along with helping African Americans advance through hard work.
Nothing shaped Armstrong's philosophy more than labor, that labor was itself spiritually valuable.
Years later, it would become more of a liberal arts institution like Howard University or Fisk University. But in the 19th century, its reputation grew as a normal school, a school for teachers. Blanche Stepp of Charlottesville studied there in the 1950s and remembers the aura that continued to surround Hampton.
As a freshman, you had to learn about the founder of the school and just various things because upperclassmen would stop you and quiz you.
Hampton's reputation grew just as public education was starting to take root in the South. One of the hottest topics following the Civil War was how to educate millions of recently freed slaves.
4 million blacks were free in the South. What to do with them without an education? So even the most die-hard racist would have to look at that situation and say, well, we must do something.
As Virginians began to clear the rubble and rebuild their lives following the Civil War, they gave the nod to a new state constitution, one that set up the state's first system of public education. Prior to the Civil War, few residents felt the state should take on the responsibility.
In this state, as in many other states, education was private. It was thought to be a family matter or perhaps a church matter.
One person who argued the state should have a role was Thomas Jefferson.
He proposed that we have state-supported and publicly supported public schools back in the 1770s, and his proposals got nowhere.
Even so, Jefferson's views were far from modern. In the early 1800s, for example, he favored educating African Americans, then sending them to Liberia in Africa.
Jefferson, Monroe, and a number of other founding fathers of this society believed that because of slavery and the stain of slavery, blacks and whites could never live together peacefully and co-equally.
Years later, when Abraham Lincoln paid for his Union victory with a bullet to the back of the head, few people argued blacks should receive anything beyond the basics.
That if they got basic literacy and could be taught domestic skills and arts and could be taught industrial arts or farming, that was probably enough.
In fact, African Americans not only had to support white schools with their tax dollars, they frequently had to dig into their own pockets to build their own schools.
There are many stories of the hat being passed at churches or at camp meetings and of poor black people who had no chance of learning to read and write themselves, reaching in their pockets, pulling out their few pennies or nickels or dollars, and putting it in there for the next generation.
Fortunately, Northern industrialists also reached into their pockets and came up with much larger amounts.
People like John D. Rockefeller and Robert Ogden, Andrew Carnegie, and others gave millions of dollars over time to Hampton and to its sister institution, Tuskegee, opened by Booker T. Washington in Alabama.
Washington started Tuskegee in 1881, not long after he graduated from Hampton Institute. He symbolized one philosophy for advancing African Americans: advancement through industrial education. W.E.B. Du Bois symbolized the other philosophy, providing a more elite curriculum to a class of leaders, which Du Bois and others called the talented 10th.
They should go to Harvard, they should go to Fisk and to Howard and study the liberal arts.
Du Bois was an intellectual himself and had studied overseas.
W.B. Du Bois was a Harvard-educated scholar who was also educated in Germany, Berlin, and who taught in Georgia.
At first, he and Washington saw eye to eye on education, but after 1900, their views split.
He thought that Booker T. Washington's policies were retrograde, they were very short-sighted, and in retrospect, they indeed were.
Southern whites backed the accommodating Washington and viewed Du Bois with suspicion. In the short run, Washington's philosophy on education prevailed, but Du Bois' impact would soon grow after he helped establish the NAACP.
Both, I would suggest, wanted the same in the end, that is respect, equality, and good education. They differed in their means of getting there and the rate at which they should move to get there.
Improving education for African Americans was also the goal of this man, Jackson Davis. He was a field agent for an organization based in New York and funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. The photography buff grew up in Richmond and studied at William and Mary in Columbia. For years, he photographed African American schools throughout the Old Dominion and around the South.
Everywhere. He was all over Virginia, he was all over the Southeast, the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, as far west as Texas. He was definitely a Booker T. Washington man, yeah, without question. He believed that, you know, education was the way to uplift the race, and the education should be practical and useful.
As he took his photographs, he also made notes in his diary.
He doesn't do a lot of philosophizing, but when he does, it seems to be fairly much in line with the sort of standard progressive ideas about education. There's a clear sense of white superiority, that the African Americans need white guidance and white assistance to set up and maintain these schools.
Actually, what they needed was more funding, better facilities, and more educated teachers. Vast disparities existed between white and black schools, disparities in teacher salaries, spending per pupil, even the length of the school year.
The gulf was enormous.
It was a dual system of education.
One school system for whites, another school system for the black population. Separate and equal was the phrase, but separate and unequal was the reality.
Indeed, as late as 1926, there was no high school in Charlottesville for African Americans, forcing many to go elsewhere for their education.
You only went as far as the 8th grade. And if you wanted to attend the high school, they went to Hampton Institute, Virginia State Union University, Hawthorne College at that time.
As a young man, Randolph White, the future publisher of the Charlottesville Albemarle Tribune, went to Ohio for high school, then joined the service. And in their younger years, the offspring of George Inge went to St. Louis for high school before going off to college.
The reason they went to St. Louis was because my grandfather had a brother that lived in St. Louis.
Despite the inequalities, African Americans rarely saw their schools as inferior. What they remember most is the camaraderie among students.
The high school I liked very much. Always liked school.
and the enthusiasm of their teachers.
They made us feel like we were important. So being discriminated against didn't make us feel like we were less than anyone.
One man who did see the inequality and spent much of his life battling it was Charles Hamilton Houston, the man who did as much as anyone to kill segregation.
Well, he was probably, at least from my perspective and some others, the most important lawyer, American lawyer in this century.
Houston graduated from Harvard University Law School at the top of his class and became the dean of the law school at Howard University. He wouldn't see segregation's collapse because he died in 1950, but he knew the best way to kill segregation was to fight for equal education.
Education is the key to success in modern life. That without it, you can't get a good job, you can't be a contributing member of society.
And he and his fellow attorneys knew the battle against segregation had to be fought in the courts, not the state legislatures.
After all, in the South, you had to be a segregationist, at least publicly, if in your heart you were not, in order to be elected.
Bill Elwood is a retired English professor who produced a documentary on Houston called The Road to Brown.
The greatest example of American democracy in my book is this American Civil Rights Movement.
Starting in the 1930s, Houston filed a series of lawsuits attacking segregation, first in higher education, then at the lower levels. The Supreme Court had ruled separate schools were fine, as long as they were equal. So Houston set out to show that equality didn't exist.
We'll just attack equal salaries, equal facilities, equal everything. And we'll make it so expensive to make those things equal that there'll be a strong incentive to give it up.
Not long after Houston and the NAACP began fighting their battles on the national level, residents in Charlottesville began doing the same thing on the local level. In 1945, Reverend Benjamin Bunn, pastor at the First Baptist Church, organized a local chapter of the NAACP.
He had always worked with the NAACP, and all the time he was a student, he was president of the NAACP.
His wife remembers that starting the chapter wasn't easy.
At that time, people were very slow to join the NAACP, and those who were on salaries were scared to death of their jobs.
Over time, he managed to desegregate the public library while she sat on the community's interracial relations panel and became the first black nurse in the Charlottesville Public Health Department.
I felt you had to work to make changes, and I did all I could.
Public parks in Charlottesville were also segregated during the first half of the century, and the city barred African Americans from playing golf at the public course in McIntyre Park. In 1949, Walter Jones began breaking down that barrier with a petition to City Council. But it was slow going.
I didn't open it up now for them to play every day in a week. They only allotted us one day a week. That was on Tuesday. We could only play on Tuesday.
Even patient care was segregated. At the University of Virginia Hospital, for example, black employees received unequal pay and benefits, and black patients received treatment in the basement. Randolph White, who worked at the hospital as a supervisor, in addition to his newspaper duties, fought successfully to change those conditions.
You had to do something.
Locally and nationally, the assault was on against segregation, and in 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court gave it a monumental blow when the court ruled that segregation had no place in public education.
It is the crucial case because it overturns the concept of separate but equal.
That's the watershed, I think, in our history. Yeah.
It would take another decade for the battle against segregation to be won. It would also take a man named Martin Luther King, freedom riders, demonstrations, ultimately federal legislation. But by 1954, there would be no turning back. So what have we learned?
It was a fact of life.
There was never any separate but equal.
It was a terrific waste of black talent and potential.
It was a time of legal barriers raised, but ultimately toppled.
African Americans are still second-class citizens.
The battle's not really over until the enemy is conceded. The enemy is not conceded.
There are people alive today who were involved in very significant ways in the preservation of segregation in Virginia. And there are people alive today who were very much involved in the attempt to destroy segregation.
It was accepted, it was a way of life.
I think it's wonderful to be able to go in a restaurant and sit down where you want to if you got the money to spend in there, and to go into stores.
So I guess it's just part of the struggle that we had to go through to get to where we are. And we're here at a step where we have giant steps awaiting us in the 21st century, I think, to do even better.
Once we got people really involved, I think they felt, well, we've broken this down, we can do it again.
To obtain